Hello, everyone on Zoom and YouTube. We'll start in about 2 to 3 minutes for Kat Chow's conversation with Larissa Pham. Good evening. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Chaucer's Books virtual author discussion with journalist and author Kat Chow. My name is Michael Takeuchi, and I am the events coordinator at Chaucer's Bookstore, a 47-year-old independent bookstore located in Santa Barbara, California, founded by our current owner, Mari Curley. To purchase tonight's book, to browse other titles, or check out our upcoming events, please go to our website at chaucersbooks.com. After tonight, we'll host marine biologist Frauke Bagushi, the author of Blue Planet, for our next event on Sunday the 19th at noon. Tonight's later at 7 p.m., we'll be talking with artist and author Jaime Cortez, the author of Gordo, a wonderful collection of short stories. While our panelists and I are the only ones seen and heard on this webinar, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's event is being simulcasted and recorded for our YouTube channel and will be available to view after program's completion. YouTubers are encouraged to use the chat to pose any questions for our guests. So let's begin. Tonight, I'm so happy to bring on reporter and writer Kat Chow. Kat was most recently a reporter at NPR, where she was a founding member of the Code Switch team, a wonderful program. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, New York Magazine's The Cut, and on Radiolab and The Sporkful. She's an occasional fourth chair on Pop Culture Happy Hour and has guest hosted Slate's podcast, The Waves. Along the way, her work has been honored in numerous ways, including receiving a national award from the Asian American Journalists Association. Her memoir, Seeing Ghosts, is an amazing piece of work that I found to be one of my most compelling reads of 2021. It had me laughing and crying, and at times, Seeing Ghosts tore my own heart out because it was so close to my own personal experience. But don't take my word for it. Listen to what Ocean Vuong, the New York Times bestselling author of On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, wrote. He wrote, Seeing Ghosts shares ground with the best memoirs, that they are the archaeologists of memory, unearthing places we have wavered in going. Like all books that haunt us long after reading, Seeing Ghosts is a courageous act of excavation and salvage. It is also a feat of rescue and healing. High praise, but well-deserved. So please welcome Kat Chow. Hello, Kat.
Thank you for that.
Joining her in conversation is Larissa Pham. She's an artist and writer living in Brooklyn. Her essays and criticism have appeared in The Nation, the Paris Review Daily, Guernica, Book Forum, and elsewhere. She is the author of Fantasian, a novella, and the essay collection Pop Song, a book that the New York Times calls a brave, shrewd work of artistic and cultural criticism. Welcome, Larissa.
Thank
So,
you.
Larissa, I have to ask you, you know Kat, and you've known her for quite some time, and if you can introduce both of you by discussing how you both know each other.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a really beautiful story. We met at a residency, in 2017, right?
Yep. Yeah,
So
2017.
it was about, I guess, almost 4 years exactly. It'll be like 4 years in October. And we started our books at the same time, and we bonded over a number of things, but I remember really concretely we had a reading among the fellows, and Kat read from a passage in this book that has like indelibly been seared into my memory, and actually is the passage that I think inspired the cover. Um,
Yes, it's about the taxidermic fish. And Larissa also read this incredibly visceral, you read this incredibly visceral draft of a short story that would appear in Kink, the
and there was also a fish
anthology.
in it.
Yes, and there was also fish in it. There was something about, so that residency was at the Jack Jones Literary Arts Retreat in Taos, New Mexico. And I just wanted to say for everyone, it was such a wonderful space because there were so many writers of color there, and it was all
Mhm.
for writers of color. And I think having a space like that was so rare in retrospect. And I think it was so defining to being able to take this book seriously. Anyway.
Mhm. Yeah, it's true. I feel like I mean so many other writers in that cohort like have had books come out or sold or in the process of writing, and yeah, I think that that was a space where our work could really be like developed and taken seriously, and it encouraged me to take my own work more seriously. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. Kat, do you want to start us off by reading like a little bit, and then we can hop into the conversation?
Absolutely. So the part that I'm going to read today, actually, I decided to read it because I've been doing a lot of driving lately on road trips or to run errands or to doctor's appointments. And it reminded me of how in high school, when I first got my license, it allowed for this source of independence, but also it let me sort of emerge from my house, which had become this symbol that I write a lot about of my mom and the life that we had together. And um, so this is sort of, I think, from when I was 16 or so. Slowly, and often without a map, I navigated the highways and streets around our house. Intuition and years of watching you and Daddy in the driver's seat led me. I flipped my blinkers on hundreds of feet before I turned. I looked over my shoulders multiple times, anxiously, before switching lanes. I wanted to yell out to the empty rows of seats behind me, "Girls, all of you help me merge, okay?" The way you had, as if invoking the child selves of my sisters and me, as you. You had always turned driving into a team sport, starting most trips by holding up a packet of Wrigley's and asking if anyone wanted any gums. Your tendency to pluralize everything was contagious, as if you were delighting in the bounty around you. "I want some gums," my sisters and I hollered back at you, a chorus. Before I unlocked the car, I did as you had frequently instructed me, Caroline, and Steph. I peered in the back seats and under the van to make sure no one was hiding there. You had heard stories of dangerous men lurking beneath women's cars in grocery store parking lots. "Somebody could be waiting to get you," you told me, your usual playfulness gone. Yet when I checked those spots as a teenager, I was not only worried that I would find a threatening man, I was anxious that I would find you. Route 2 was one of the only freeways that didn't scare you, Mommy. That you had sat in this same driver's seat years earlier never escaped me. This muscle memory had guided me. It was not just mine, it was our version of autopilot. A year before, when I was 15, I wrote in my journal, "My father once told me success makes a person survive." He repeated this frequently when we argued about college, where he thought I should apply, all the Ivy Leagues, where he thought would actually admit me. Definitely not any of the Ivies, possibly not our state schools, despite my honors classes and decent grades. I was never sure how to respond when he leaned on this phrase. When you died, we had clutched at whatever it was that might translate to survival. My father thought accolades or money would do the trick. At the time, this confounded me. It did not seem we had either. I understood now that it is all relative. We had what my father had always hoped for when first moving to America: a house with a mortgage, a seemingly assured way to go to college, enough food. This ascent up the so called societal ladder, made possible because American law had so conveniently decided he was the right type of immigrant, was enough for him. My father wrote on my financial aid forms that he spent $500 on food a year, and to him, this was due to frugality and not a sign of poverty. Our dependence on the state's Medicaid program for healthcare was a product of circumstance, not class. This was his rationale, which he passed on to me, which would take me years to question. On my way home from hanging with friends or school, I drove the same route you took from the barn, my left foot bare and tucked under my right leg, and my shoes kicked under my seat. After midnight, Route 2 to Wethersfield was dependably empty. It let its stillness comfort me. The Glastonbury woods and Connecticut River snaked black underneath the pavement and the concrete bridges. On summers, I rolled down the windows and crooned along to whatever CD that Kaya or another friend Meg had burned me. In many of these moments, I felt calm and contemplative, and the loneliness that often registered instead felt right. I would miss these moments later in life, how freeing it felt to be by myself, with so much in my future feeling like a possibility. Thank you.
Now I'm off mute. Thank you for sharing that passage. I feel like it really encapsulates like this turning point in your narrator's life. And it actually leads into this question that I had for you, which I didn't want to like start with like a softball, but maybe this is like going right into hardball. But when we met, I know that we had a conversation about this being, a grief memoir. But in conversations we've had since then, you've moved away from that term. And in this passage, you talk a lot about survival as like a guiding principle for like, decisions made in your life and decisions made by your father. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about the relationship between like this idea of Seeing Ghosts being a book about grief, and then also in a lot of ways it being a book about survival.
Yeah, I think that when I first started on this book, I knew that it was going to be about grief and loss more generally. And I wasn't sure how it would be structured. I think I knew that I needed to somehow trace the losses that my parents had experienced. And that in doing so, I would really understand what losing my mother at a young age had done to me. And I knew that grief was also so defining, but I think as I was writing this book, I realized that it wasn't just the idea of grief that I was chasing, it was the idea of loss more generally. And the way I saw my family navigate, I mean, I just saw so much loss, and it was as if they were trying to constantly navigate and fill this negative space where, coming from Hong Kong, where both of my parents moved from in the 60s and 70s, they had to, like so many other immigrants, just forge lives for themselves and create these communities out of isolation. And as a child, I was so aware of that, but didn't quite know how that became so embedded and tied to the grief that I experienced after my mom died. And so much of writing this book was about trying to show how all of those things coalesced. And it's not just about my mom's death. It's it's a book about the generational loss and really both of my parents' stories.
Yeah, and I think related to that, like another question I have for you, and maybe it's one that's probably constantly changing in terms of your relationship to this question, but I was really curious, like, when did you know where this story begins and ends?
Ooh.
Because, it's like, I had a writing instructor tell me this once when I was talking about writing about family, and I was like, yeah, I don't know, I think I'll write about my mom and like her grandma. And then this instructor was like, well, like the thing about your grandmother is she had a mother too. It's like, how far back do we go? And I'm curious, like, there is like a chronological expanse of time that is covered in this book, but you do a lot of like research as to like your family's background, and I was wondering like what that contour looked like for you.
That's so interesting. I mean, it made me think of how, in a lot of ways, I started trying to write this book when I was in college, and I didn't even realize it. Or I'd been writing different versions of it throughout just the past decade and a half when I was, or even like 2 decades. And I think I was trying to, in the earlier iterations, tell this story of my mom's death. And sometimes it was through poetry, and sometimes it was through a very autobiographical novel, which was what was in college in the works. But I remember in earlier versions, I really just thought it would be about the lead up to my mom's death. And it was when I realized that so much of this book was about where she came from and the origin of the origins, is I think how I put it, that I realized was so important. And just tracing the ideas of where my parents both learned to grieve. And it's actually funny because when I understood what this book was and when I sort of began to write it, I knew where I wanted it to begin and end because I decided that I wanted it to kind of be structured around this quest, built
Mm-hmm.
around the ghosts in the book. And um, a lot of this book is structured around this ghost story that I try and weave throughout the story, which really comes from something my mom joked about when I was 9 years old. And before she even knew that she was terminally ill, she joked to me because she knew I was afraid of all things dead or taxidermied, that one day when she passed, she wanted me to have her body stuffed and put in my future apartment. And like that's like a really macabre thing to tell a child. But that really stuck with me for many reasons because one, it was scary, but two, it was so visceral. And it also made me think a lot about, like now as an adult reflecting on it, it sort of mirrored what you and I have talked a lot about before, which is in a lot of sort of Asian cultures or Asian immigrant cultures, there's sometimes a tendency to do ancestor veneration where I feel like you're always praying to the spirits to appease them or your dead ancestors. And so I knew that I wanted to work that in as this ghost like element where my mother and the other people who had died before were people who we had to appease. And so for my mother, it was we had to bury my brother's remains with her. And then for my father's mother, it was to be buried with her husband. And so there were a lot of these loose ends. And so I knew I had to kind of connect them and arrive at this end point where these things maybe would be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I feel like it is absolutely a through line in the book, but it also, I mean, the way this book is constructed is so interesting because you're moving fluidly through time, but
Yeah.
there is this like driving force that you become aware of. Like, first there's like the loss of Jonathan, and then a little bit later, like as your character grows up, like we see like this desire to like appease your mother, like make her happy
Yeah.
by reuniting them. Yeah, and I think it's also, I mean, I don't want to spoil the book too much, but the way that everything kind of comes together is really beautiful. That's more of an observation than a question.
Thank you.
Um, but I mean, I have so many questions for you, and I don't know which one to ask first. I will say, like, I could definitely feel just like so steeped in like the sense of like the dead being present while reading this, and I do think it felt very real to me in terms of like I also grew up with like an altar, like a dedicated altar room in the house. It was like
Yeah.
right next to my bedroom actually, so I would go to sleep like smelling incense, and like I always felt like this very heavy presence of like the ancestors of my family, like being right there.
Yeah, just this
Yeah, so
the
that
smell
really
of
resonated.
incense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's so evocative too. And I think
Mm-hmm.
as a child I sort of accepted it and I didn't really know what else to think. And as an adult now I find it really beautiful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's really comforting, and it's funny. Like when I first went to college, and like people like were burning like incense for fun. I was like, "You burn this for fun? Like there's no prayer attached. Like this isn't like an offering or anything."
Yeah, this is really yeah, shouldn't you think about your dead ancestors or something? I don't know.
Totally.
Yeah.
this is a good segue into another question, which is yeah, I think there is this theme of your mother reappearing, like sort of the specter of like the taxidermied mother, which you describe as like the ginger ghost in the beginning, kind of like moving awkwardly, and it is like the sense that she's caught between states. And throughout the book there are these moments where your narrator like encounters her, or is imagining her, and I was curious how you think of those moments. Like, do
Yeah.
they are they I guess it's like, are they memories that you remember, or also are they like visions that you're conjuring in the writing and like thinking about that memory, and then also like maybe inserting her there or seeing her there or talking to her?
Yeah, I tended to want to make those. I knew that I was writing into the uncertainty of who my mother was, where there are just so many things that I can't ask her and that I don't know, and questions that my family couldn't seem to answer. Like just teeny things about like, what did she like to eat, what did she like to wear, and it was a really useful thing to be able to take this kind of distorted and very, physical image of her. Like when you think of a ghost, you don't necessarily think of this sort of uh sort of like corpse,
It's usually more like ethereal, right? You don't
yeah,
think of a
exactly. And so I
physical.
wanted to play with that and kind of turn the idea of the ghost on its head. And in a lot of these cases, when my mother as a ghost is evoked, I tried to use a lot of direct address to kind of show both the distance and closeness between us, where I think whenever I tend to write with you or I read books that use this direct address, even if it's sort of in a passing moment, I always feel as though it's this attempt at intimacy, and yet there's still so much distance between the speaker and the subject. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you also feel that too, but I loved that because it shows so much longing and there's so much yearning within it, where I felt as though in trying to write to her, I was trying to cross this distance. But
Mm-hmm.
for a ghost, you can't. And that's what I found so like to bring about so much tension, because this ghost cannot speak back, or maybe it can, and who knows what the rules are for this vision or memory. And I wanted it to be very ambiguous, and I wanted the reader to sort of be able to layer on their own interpretation. And I found it really, hopefully, playful and evocative, and maybe a little bit melancholy too.
Yeah, I mean, I was really moved by those passages of direct address, and I mean, it's funny. I also just read a book that also uses a lot of direct address, but it's
Yes, I know.
the figure is like a lover, and they're living. So it's definitely different, but I totally, it resonates. Like, I think being on the other side, like reading that as a reader and knowing who you were speaking to, like I did feel that sense of like yearning, and also the sense that like, in a book you can say things that you wouldn't say in real life. Um, it's like another mode of communication, and I feel
Yeah.
like in this book, like it does serve as like, it's like a list of things you couldn't say, but it's also like you're saying them in a way that you probably wouldn't have been able to say in real
Yeah.
life as
I
well.
love that you just said that. In books, you can say things that you might not be able to say in real life, because that's what I also loved so much about pop song too. It felt both lyrical in its ability to access emotions or feelings or ideas that it seemed as though you as the narrator were really like searching for it. It felt like such a searching book. Pop song
Yeah,
is
I
a
think
great
we both
book.
wrote really searching books. I mean, this is your book event, so I'm gonna,
No, I mean, I think everyone should buy both of our books. Here they
yeah,
are
buy
on my
them
shelf.
together. They were born at the same residency.
Yeah, we were born at the Jack Jones Literary Arts Retreat.
Yeah, they're both well, I don't know. They were conceived there, I guess. I don't know what their star signs are. Um, but actually, on a lighter note, I want to ask you another question that I don't think I've brought up in our conversations. But I wanted to ask you, yeah, about your use of humor. I feel like there's some really funny moments in this book that I like wasn't expecting, but I also know like you to be a very like deadpan person. So then I was like, okay, like this makes sense, but also like, yeah, like what was that like, or like how are you thinking about that, or like just
Yeah,
you know?
it's really, I'm so relieved that people find parts of this book funny because I think all throughout my life I've always wondered or worried, that people don't understand my deadpan humor sometimes. And to have a whole book of that is a lot. But I knew that I wanted to bring my mom's very specific macabre sense of humor to life here because I didn't want her to just remain on the page as just the circumstances of her death. And I thought that it was so important that her joy and her humor, but also the humor that we inherited from her, and even my dad's sense of humor too, which itself is very specific. It's so observational. I wanted that to come through. And when I started getting reviews where people were sort of pointing out that it wasn't just this heavy book and that the humor and the funnier parts of it were resonating, I was so relieved. And it made me think of how I was reading these interviews that Aquafina did with Lulu Wang after The Farewell came out.
Mhm.
And they had this experience where they were screening the movie, I think for the first time with an audience. And they noticed that the audience was just laughing so much at all of these parts that they didn't realize were funny. And to them, it was kind of this horrifying experience, but also a moment when they realized that this movie was no longer theirs.
Mhm.
And I'm finding that very much with like many different parts of this book and what's resonating with people and what's surprising them and what's making them feel something.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I'm gonna push you a little on that. I feel like there's this moment, right, when you write a book and you're like, this is for me, like this is like what I want to do, and then you put it out into the world and it becomes different. I wonder if you could speak a little about, I know you've touched on it before, but like, yeah, like when did you feel ready to like tell the story in its form? Because you've mentioned talking about it, um, and like wanting to write about like a variation of it in the past,
Yeah.
but like, why now? And then like now that it's in this form, like do you feel like you're going to write about this more, or
Yeah.
kind of an
I
open-ended question?
That's a good question, though. I mean, I think I knew that I wanted to write this book when I felt I could do it justice and do it in the
Mhm.
way that I wanted because I was looking at notes that I had in college to myself, where I would type out these notes in like a Zenka or something like that, or like a live journal, some like internet blog that was private and only for myself. And it would be notes about this very autobiographical novel that I didn't really think was autobiographical, but it still had like a protagonist who was basically me and a father figure and this absent mother. Um, and I kept thinking, I think I just read Junot Diaz or something. And I was really interested in magical realism and his use of fuku or whatever curse is embedded into the text of that book. And I know he's a very complicated person now, but I found his voice really fascinating, but also this use of Dominican tradition, and also sort of context. I think that book had so many footnotes. I have not read it in almost a decade, but there were so many footnotes that were a part of it. And I remember reading that and thinking, like, this is really an interesting use of merging an older idea and making it very
Mhm.
contemporary and doing it with voice and humor. And I remember in this blog post, I wrote something like, should I do magical realism? Is it like too much of a Chinese American trope?
Oh
And
my gosh.
it took me, I forgot that I even wrote that. And when I read that maybe 3 years ago, I was like, holy shit. I mean, I'm glad that these ideas are things that have just stuck with me. And it's as if they've just been hanging out in the back of my head, waiting for me to figure out how to do it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think something that I really loved in this book, and almost something that I think I wish I could have seen more of, but maybe, would have like derailed it, was like the way that your character was like moving through time and kind of, yeah, engaged in this process of like thinking about the project that would become this book, like from a very young age, like the journal entries. I can't believe you still have your old journals. That's incredible.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. The first few drafts had so many more. And there were even footnoted versions where I would just include passages from diary entries. Too
Wow.
much.
Yeah. Sometimes you need to do it to like get to the final draft. Like the first draft of Pop Song included like I think 3 pages of like a Gmail argument, a GChat argument that I had with my and then Jonathan was like, we're gonna cut that.
Don't have that in there.
Yeah. But there was this moment where you're in college and you're working on, and you mentioned this like so subtly that like I think, you know, if I weren't reading this to be like, I need to, you know, come up with really smart questions for Kat. There's this moment where you're like, oh yeah, I was working on like this, my senior thesis on like, you know, and it's about like, I think it was like Asian American like melancholia and like grief.
Yeah, Asian American grief as seen in film or something like that.
Yeah, and you like subject your family to watching this movie.
I know.
1,000 Years of Good Prayers, which I just read that short story recently. And it's very moving.
It's so moving, yeah.
But yeah, I think it's so cool to see the way that your like your character is like navigating something that ultimately like will turn into this project. And I actually want to ask you, like, you know, what was it like to write these versions of yourself over time? Like when the book begins, like you're quite young.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was hard because so much of this perspective, or so much of this book is grounded in the perspective of a child, where so many of these memories are from when I was 13 or younger. And it took being able to figure out how to create these multiple voices to interrogate these memories. So I like to think of like this book as told from a more present day narrator, Kat. And toward the end of the book, it swings into, I don't know if this is like too much detail for the average audience member, but like toward the end, it swings into present tense completely in the last section. And I wanted to do that to kind of show the arc of the journey that we go through within seeing ghosts, and how the narrator, like the book itself begins in present tense and then ends there too, to just sort of show what it means to sort of be returned to your body, so to speak, and to have not exactly like a pat understanding of this loss, but something closer to it.
And I think it also reflects like, I mean, the reality of writing something down, right? Is that like we write it from a specific seat. And I mean, we talked about this, like this idea of creating like an internally consistent point of view or world within a book. But you're writing it from that seat, and then it'll end in that place, but like life will keep going.
Yeah. I think that the writer T.K. Madden does that really well. I don't know if you've read Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, but toward the end, she sort of swings through, and that book in general, the structure is, it's fragmented in that there's so many different kind of explosive chapters that I loved so much. But then toward the end, she introduces a whole set of other characters, siblings that she'd never known about, that have her questioning her sense of self, but also sort of certainty about family. And I loved that. And I loved the way it kind of shifted our perspective as readers into being at the orientation of sort of like, yes, this is your life, and it's ongoing, and it continues after the book. And even if you had assumed your story would end here, it really keeps going.
Yeah. And I think like the shape of this book would be very different if like, you know, you were still engaged in this quest of like trying to, you know, reunite like your grandparents. And I mean, you know, maybe it would be a different book. It would maybe not be done yet. So it's incredible how those like decisions inform like the text as it evolves, and it's so recent too.
Yeah, I think my father found his, so the story that Loris and I are referring to is my grandfather and my father on my paternal side, he left Hong Kong or Guangzhou or China sometime in the 20s or 30s. no one really knows because there's just not much family archives about this. There's none that we could find. And he lived and died in Cuba and worked in restaurants there and sent remittances back, which was fairly common, especially because immigrants from China were not allowed into the United States because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I was so taken by this history, but I didn't quite know how to write it. You know, like how do you write into something you don't know? And so I used a lot of reporting to try and answer that question. And I kind of leaned on academic texts in one draft and read so much about Chinese Cubans. But I sort of ultimately understood that why I was struggling was because my father, in real time, in real life, was going on this quest to find his father's remains. And my sister Caroline and I had gone to Cuba unsuccessfully with our father to search for these bones. And I was writing with the idea that there was nothing to be found. And then I think in 2019, my dad he just went on this trip and didn't really give me enough notice to go with him. And um, he was able to find his father's remains there. And that was when I knew that there would be just a different narrative for this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so aware that I was living my life, you know, for myself, but then also that as a writer, I had to make sense of it very quickly because I was tasked with writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is such a strange and surreal feeling when you find those two things intersecting. All right, so I'm gonna take a breath to like kind of like process this.
Yeah.
And then the question that I have for you is related to this, and it's something that we spoke about earlier. But in your bio, it says that you are a writer and journalist, or maybe it's journalist and writer. I'm actually going to check my copy to see the order. Yeah, a writer and journalist. And I like that you have a distinction between the two because I think they are related practices, but I
Yeah.
think they kind of have maybe fundamentally different goals and processes through which like the work is made. And I see them both overlapping in this text, and I was wondering if you would speak to that.
Yeah. Not to knock on journalists because I love that as a profession. I love that. But I was thinking about this because I find those distinctions so hard for me to kind of paint because I think that journalism can be very artful. But I think of when I think of myself as a writer, which is something that I think I've only really been able to call myself more in recent years, because it feels almost like I feel almost sheepish calling myself a writer sometimes, or at least I used to. And I think it's because I associate that with creating art and making something that um, could could move someone or be for someone to experience and take as their own. And then for journalism, which is similar in a lot of ways because I still want my journalistic work to be beautiful and compelling and hopefully moving, but um, it's more for the sake of information and hopefully complicating someone's understanding of something. And maybe, you know, there's some overlap in the Venn diagram of writer and journalist in a lot of ways, but um, I don't know. Those are two definitions I'm still working out, but I think that's probably what it gets closest to. What do you think? What are your distinctions?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like I come at it from the other side, which is I can definitely be like, oh yeah, I'm a writer. But if someone's like, well, are you a journalist? And I'll be like, well, I've reported before. I
Yeah.
like have tape a call on my phone. I don't know if that like qualifies me as like someone who I think journalism and reportage, you know, requires a kind of willingness to engage with the world. And I think the multiplicity of the world in a way that like, you know, writing as a solitary act doesn't in a way. So I think with journalism, you do have a much bigger responsibility to the world in some ways to make sure that you're representing it well. Whereas I think with writing, or at least creative nonfiction, there is like quite a bit of like fabrication involved. And it's not like fabrication like you're making something up, but it's like fabrication as in like you're creating a scaffolding of a story to put the things that you found to be true in
Yeah.
place.
Yeah, I think so. And then also for journalism too, I mean, I don't want to like steer us into this discussion about objectivity, but I think that for me in all of my reporting, I try to interrogate where that perspective is coming from, because so much of it too is about building the scaffolding and trying to create an argument in a journalistic practice. Um, and so I'm always so suspicious when people, usually white men, try to argue that journalism it needs to be objective because from what standpoint are you writing from them? I don't know. That's just the beginning of a rant that should not happen tonight.
Okay, well, we can table that for the next time we chat in person. But it's true. I think like basically I think galaxy brain take, but I think every form of creative output has to navigate truth in some capacity. And I think it says a lot about either the medium or someone's relationship to the medium with how they see their relationship to truth. And like if we're even like able to provide a semblance of truth or not. So maybe, okay, I'll leave that there. But I actually, okay, on a lighter note, I think maybe we can fit like one more question, maybe like a combo question before the Q&A.
Ooh, fun. Okay.
I know that you wanted to talk about taxidermy. I also want to talk about the use of food in this book. I don't think that they're unrelated in terms of just like the use of physical objects and sensory experiences in this text.
Ooh, interesting.
So how about you pick the one that you want to talk about first?
Well, let's talk about food then, because I feel like I haven't been asked much about food in these conversations. So I'm fascinated. Yeah.
A huge part of the book, or it was for me. I got so hungry when I was reading it.
Oh, thank you. I grew up, with a father who owned a restaurant. And it's funny because food to me showed such a difference in how my sisters and I navigated the world and how my dad navigated the world and how my mom did. Where for my father, one of his favorite sayings was, everything winds up the same in your stomach anyway, which as a writer now, I find such an interesting thing for someone who owned a restaurant to say. And part of that was what helped me ground my father as this character, because so many of the scenes that I find him really coming to life are where we're cooking together, or I'm trying to understand his restaurant or his choices in having that. And what it really came down to, I think for him, was wanting to be closer to his father who worked in restaurants. And so I realized as I was writing this that perhaps that was also why I decided to work in a restaurant in high school. And that allowed for so many visceral moments of food, which is, I think, I don't know, if you grew up in an immigrant family or, any family, maybe food is just such a big tie to how you communicate with each other, and how you show love. One of the lines that I was so glad could stay in this book was this anecdote where I'm asking my father, I think I'm asking him what he misses most about my mom, his wife. And he says something like, oh, I miss when she cut fruit for me. And I remember in that moment being so sort of offended on her behalf by thinking like, women are not meant just to serve you. But I realized that almost anyone who has had a Chinese mother knows that cutting fruit is this act of love. And it was small details like that I think also helped sort of create this atmosphere of care and longing and love. And that was so central to the book.
Yeah. And I feel like food is like something that's like constantly like you need to eat to live, and like, but also you eat food and then it's gone. So then you have to like make more of it. So there's a sense of like, there is a sense of impermanence associated with it because like, I don't know, you digest it, it becomes part of you.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is such like a big feature of the book for me, at least, like in my encounter with it seems really interesting when we think about like, or when I think about like all these other gestures towards like permanence or towards like this kind of preservation that are
Yeah.
also happening at the same time.
Yeah, I think that there's this line that Anne Anlin Chang, who she was one of the Asian American scholars who sort of came up with this idea of racial melancholia, and she was building on Freud's concept of mourning and melancholy. And she had this line, I don't remember the exact quote now, but she was making the distinction between mourning, which has an end in sight, and melancholy, which is very pervasive. And the person who is melancholic might not know, they know that they've lost something, but they might not know exactly what. And she basically said that it was as if the person who's in mourning eats and feasts on what they have lost.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of somebody eating their own grief and it becoming a part of them and them needing it and it sating them and them having this craving for it. Because I think that's what she was getting at. It just becomes so much a part of their identity. I realized that that was when perhaps eating imagery could also like really tie well with so much longing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like it's like in the act of grieving like the things that cause us pain, you know, like remembering like like a treasured memory or something, like you're like, oh, like it hurts me to think about this and I'm like eating this like amazing like memory trying to like hang on to it, but it's just gonna like feed like
Yeah.
the sorrow. It's like a cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. All right, should we maybe move into Q&A? I think
Yes.
we have one question, so we can also just keep chatting while questions roll in.
Sure.
Please, I think there might be questions on YouTube as well, but I haven't seen them. Okay, so we have one, which is from Terry, who says, I'm halfway through the book and am loving it. I was curious about you calling your parents mommy and daddy. Even your father uses this term when talking about your mom. Was this how you and your sisters normally addressed your parents, as opposed to gung gung and popo for your grandparents?
Oh, Terry, that's a good question. That's actually a question that I had to answer multiple times throughout like the copy edits of the book too. I liked using mommy and daddy because that was so close to how we talked about and talk about our parents still in my family, which I think I know is might be a little jarring for people, but it's interesting. My dad still refers to his wife as mommy, sort of like in reference to his daughters. And also he refers to his mom too as mommy. And I think it's probably such a vestige of spending so much time talking to your children about like what to call them, but also maybe the era of when they came to this country. I don't know. But yes, we did call our grandparents Gong Gong and Papa. And we called my aunts and uncles Kafu and Ima too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like Jade Chang does this in the Wangs versus the World,
Yeah.
where the father character, he refers to himself as daddy. And that, like, oh my God, like just like like an Asian father character referring to himself in third person as daddy, just
I know.
like makes my heart just like squeeze, because like my dad does that too. And he'll just like he'll call me and like leave a voicemail. He'll be like, hey Larissa, like it's daddy, like call me back, you know.
Yeah, I love when they say who it is. It's like I don't know who else would be calling me and leaving me a voice message who has your voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's such a good distinction. I think also this question makes me think of when I would name my mom as Bo Moi, her Chinese name, or mommy, or you, or there's one section I think where I reveal her name in English, which was Florence. But that was also really hard because it brought about the question of, am I going to give my mother sort of agency as her own character who is separate from her relationship as a mother? And those were choices that I had to make every single time she came up in this book. And that was a really interesting question to ask myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it shows that you had, I mean, I don't want to say a system. I feel like that's too clinical for what it is, but like
Yeah.
you had these modes of relating, and I think the formal choice like shows, I think like it is really considered.
Oh, good. Thanks. I'm so
Yeah.
glad.
Yeah, I mean, I was really taken by like, the direct address, and then hearing, your father, like the way that you were depicting his speech and his way of talking and the way he referred to your family members. So
Yeah.
I found it really evocative, which is to say true. So
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I mean, it was interesting because I think maybe this is where my experience as a journalist comes into play, where I wanted the dialogue, even if it was something I was recalling, to still feel honest and true to his speech patterns in a way that, obviously wasn't um, making fun of him and hopefully was really respectful. And I think one of the scenes that really taught me a lot about how he spoke was when I was trying to transcribe, or when I transcribed a video that I'd taken of us having having a conversation about identity and the term Asian American and whether or not he used that for himself. And it was really nice to be able to just show how my father speaks there, because to me, I think it's perfect English, and it was really important to have that on the page.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think everyone has, voice, and it's important to be accurate to it. And I did notice that you set your dialogue in italics, as opposed to quotation marks, which I interpreted as a sign of like, this is memory, but it's also like an effort at reality.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think there were moments when I was wondering if I should only put my mom's dialogue in italics and then keep the rest of the families in my own in quotations. And I was trying to play around with things like that could sort of differentiate everything. But ultimately, I liked the italics because it grounded everything in this kind of perspective of recollection.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we could have a really long conversation about the quality of memory and
I know.
quality of memory right now, but we will not do that, um, just in the interest of time. So we have two more questions in the Q&A, and I'm actually maybe going to combine them into one hybrid question that is interesting to me, and hopefully interesting to you, which is, I'm merging these two questions from Ruby and Raven into a hybrid question, which is, now that the book is out, have you talked to your sisters and father about it? And then how did you navigate sharing this story of your life with like a larger reading public?
Yeah.
Yeah, how did you navigate that, or how do you conceive of that?
So for the sort of first part of the question, um, this book is so much about my family that I had to interview them for it. And they were such a central part to how I could tell this narrative. And I interviewed both my sisters and my dad and my aunts and uncles and other people who knew my mom too, to kind of make this text what it was. And so throughout the whole process, my family was pretty in tune with what this book was going to be, and they read early drafts. And so we were always kind of talking about it. So I don't think the tenor of the conversations has changed now that it's actually out. But for how it's been having my life out in public view, it's interesting because I still see this. Well, it feels both very personal. It also is not my entire life. And I see this as this narrative that I've constructed. And it's creative nonfiction in that I have, as you mentioned, Larissa, scaffolded and taken elements of this to create a story where I think that, people might feel a closeness to me, and they might feel hopefully that this book resonated with them. But then at the same time, this is only just one version of my life, and I could retell it in so many different ways now if you gave me another 10 years. So I think that while it's strange to have people out there knowing intimate details of my life, at the same time it's a narrative I've chosen to tell too. So it still feels as though there's I still feel as though I have parts of myself for me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear you say that. I feel like I also have like a similar relationship to memoir, and it's like yeah, I did or like in your case you did a really good job of sharing what you wanted to share. But I also am aware as a reader that there is like this is a story that was like put together and carefully worked on for many years to be what it is.
Yeah.
Um, and it is kind of its own thing now, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. It's its own thing, and it's something that people can take as their own and interpret and layer their own meanings on. And
Hmm.
it's in a way no longer mine.
Yeah, yeah. So the author is dead.
And the author is dead.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that's what's really beautiful about, I think vulnerability is a tricky word when we talk about creative nonfiction and memoir, especially memoir by like women. But I do think that the vulnerability that you have chosen to show in this text um, is like it's like you're placing trust in the reader to like be able to connect with something. And as a reader, I feel that trust, and I'm like, okay, like I feel like I have permission to hear the story, and like I have a mother, I have a father, I had grandparents,
Yeah.
so like I like that resonates with me as well, and I feel like okay and like understanding this because I trust that you've chosen to tell it to me. So it's kind of like this contract that we enter into.
Oh, thank you. Can I ask how you thought about that with Pop Song, if that changed as you were writing it, and then when after it came out, your orientation toward it?
It was definitely, I think, a little different because I wrote Pop Song mostly in isolation. So I wasn't really I just couldn't think about the outside world when I was writing it. I was like, I have to just like get it out onto the page, and then I'll pull it back if I need to. And I ended up pulling it back somewhat, but I also was like, like there are some things that you can say in a book that you can't say anywhere else, or like there are things that you can say in certain ways in a text that you can't do in like a blog post or
Yeah.
like a long form article even. So there is like yeah, there are things that are heavy for sure, there are things that are like personal for sure, but I see in the same way as like this is like something that I've chosen to tell, and like maybe that knowledge makes someone feel closer to me or closer to my experience. But I did write it in a way to hopefully like provide a version of like a text for a younger self, which I think you also have mentioned. And
Yeah. Yeah. I think
so I
so. I
think
mean,
it is for that younger self, and like there is probably a version of like both of our younger selves like walking around a Barnes and Noble right now, and hopefully someone watching this is like gonna pick up a copy.
I mean, it's interesting because my 16-year-old cousin, a couple weeks before this book came out, I gave her a copy. And I was a little nervous because she is, she's my Yima, so my aunt's granddaughter. And I also spoke to this aunt so much for the story in this book. And so giving it to my aunt to give to my cousin it felt so it felt so wonderful and vulnerable and tender. And I was so curious what my cousin would make of this story, not knowing who my mom was and not knowing a lot of this family history. And it was really wonderful because I understood it. It was as if I was giving her this family archive, but also one that was less messy than real life and hopefully with an interesting narrative structure. And she would just send me these texts as she was reading. And she is probably the only person in my life who I would allow to text me as she's incrementally reading like 2 chapters and responding directly to it. Because I think otherwise it's just too much for anyone else. Um, but it was really interesting to imagine how she was interpreting something that was both so close and distant.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, she used a lot of emojis like this and
Oh wow.
a lot of like pointing emojis and like smoke coming out of her nose emojis. So I think that meant she liked it.
Well, it sounds like you got a lot right, which I think probably really really tough critics. So I mean, it sounds like you've really given her a gift.
I hope so. I hope she writes too.
Yeah. All right, I think
I think that's a sign.
I want to keep chatting.
Thank you, Larissa, for such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, and thank you for such a gift of a book.
Oh.
Thank you both for joining us. And please, everyone, go to chaucersbooks.com and get a copy of Pop Song and Seeing Ghosts. So thank you both, Larissa, and thank you, Kat, for a wonderful talk tonight.
Woo!
Yay.
Have a nice evening.
Take care, all. Have a
Care.
good one.